Well, let me push back, if you will. Allow me to play devil's advocate here.
Okay.
Say that reparations have been granted going all. I did a little brief history going all the way back to before we were even a country. 1781, two individuals that have been enslaved for 40 years in Massachusetts and worked on a particular piece of property. You can call it plantation, although I don't think Massachusetts had plantations as such, but they certainly were a part of that residence for 40 years and worked as slaves. I guess because of the revolution and the result of the revolution, the owner, who must have been a loyalist, left and went to England. And so these two slaves petitioned the Massachusetts, I guess, Commonwealth to get the ownership of that property. And while they denied them ownership of the property, they did settle with them to get 12 pounds per year for the rest of their lives, which actually 12 sounds little, but 12 pounds in 1781 was a decent amount of change, or
Mhm.
as the homies would say, a decent amount of cheddar, if
Yes.
you will. So they received reparations. 2 years later, in 1783, also in Massachusetts, a lady named Belinda Sutton, who was freed by her master after 50 years of service. She went to Nova Scotia in Canada, and she successfully sued and won 15 pounds for every year of the rest of her life for the slavery sweat equity that she put into that property. Of course, you are familiar with, and many of our listeners are familiar with, William T. Sherman, General Sherman. He's not only famous for blazing a bloody and burning path in Georgia to win the war for the Union, he's also famous for Special Order number 15, which established that Black Americans, or certain Black Americans, I think in the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina, would be entitled to 40 acres and a mule. Contrary to popular belief, Spike Lee didn't start that. The white guy, General William T. Sherman, did. The list is too long of the number of reparations payments and the millions of dollars that have been given to Native Americans. And by the way, I'm not against that. That's fully justified. Just briefly, in 1927, the Shoshone tribe received $6 million commitment. In 1924, some Native Americans in Pueblo, Colorado, received $1.3 million. And fast forward to 1946 through 1978, the Indian Claims Commission gave over $818 million. The most famous one that I remember from my youth, when we were both in college or high school, was 1988, under Ronald Reagan. The 1988 Civil Liberties Act awarded $1.2 billion to Japanese Americans that had been interned, or whose parents had been interred unconstitutionally and unjustly during the Second World War. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Democrat, by the way, is the one who did that one. The internment, not the payment. Reagan did the reparations payment. Roosevelt was the one who interred them in the first place. So when you see the multitude of reparations payments that the United States government has paid and is not out of business, last time I checked, dealing with legitimate fiscal concerns. But I'm really talking the moral question. Why are all these other groups entitled for reparations, or some would say for justice, but Black Americans themselves are not?
Sadly, what winds up happening is if you've ever worked in the credit industry, one of the things that you know is that after a certain point, if a debt is owed for a certain period of time, companies do what's called a charge off. In other words, they eventually charge it off, meaning they've come to recognize that that debt will never get paid. Now, if they decided they kept that debt on their books and they decided it was going to continue to go forward, you would wind up collecting a massive debt with massive interest. And that's what we've got here. We've literally got a situation where we're talking 400 years of interest that has accrued on this debt. When you talk about every single one of the amounts that you just talked about, we're all in the millions, even into the hundreds of millions. But now let's now get into the hundreds of billions of dollars is what it was just for the state of California. And by the way,
Wow.
didn't have slavery. Imagine now what that is going to be for the entire United States. Part of the problem is that this is something that should have been dealt with, I don't know, back in the 1800s, back in the 1900s, when we were a lot closer to, when we were still dealing with many of the consequences as a result of slavery.
And some of the slaves or former slaves were still alive.
Exactly, exactly. You actually could pay money to the people who have been actually impacted. Nowadays, it's a little hard to determine who exactly has been impacted. Let me ask you a question. Do you believe that Michael Jordan is due a reparations check?
That's a darn good question. Morally, yes, but financially, it would be insane to give Michael Jordan reparations.
Right. It's just, once again, first of all, there's a certain level of practicality. I think it is important for there to be a recognition.
Right.
And I think that, I just recall when I went through civics or social studies or whatever, history, I think is what we called it back when I was in school. I just remember that I do remember that slavery and Jim Crow was really kind of brushed over and wasn't really talked about in the degree that it could have and should have been. I think that a recognition and an acknowledgement of that in our history, I think, is important. And once again, so that you're not whitewashing it, so that you're, I won't say whitewash, but so that you're not watering it down, so that people truly understand what happened.
Right. Right.
But having said that, making the actual financial remuneration to compensate for that, I don't see how that is possible. And the challenge that you have is when you tie in the financial remuneration, something that can't be paid, then you wind up with animosity on both sides. Those who believe, all right, look, we've quantified what's been owed to me. Why aren't you giving it to me? And then on the other side, well, look, I wasn't even around. I didn't benefit. My ancestors didn't benefit. Why do I have to pay that ungodly amount? Right. You wind up creating a friction that does nothing to heal the wounds caused by the very thing that you're paying reparations for.